Hello. It is time for my 1930s TBR. Now, with social distancing and the library being closed, I honestly literally have almost none of these books as physical copies. I'm going to read nine out of 10 of them as ebooks or audiobooks this month. I just don't have the access to get them, but I don't want to pause this challenge just because I can't get physical copies. So I will be putting covers up over here at different points during this video just to show you what I'm talking about. But I hope you're not here just because I'm holding up a physical copy of a book. I'm just not going to be doing it this month. So the 1930s were really defined by one thing in particular, and that was the Great Depression. The stock market crashed in 1929, and it didn't recover until 1939 when World War II started. So politically speaking, that's really the only thing going on, at least in North America, or at least in the United States, during the 1930s. I assume that Europe is mostly rebuilding from World War I, but as an American, I don't have a huge grasp on European history. I do know that the Spanish Civil War happened, and then the Communist Party obviously was formed in the 1930s, but I assume most of Europe is probably like recovering from World War I, and the United States is in a depression. For literature in the 1930s, there are a handful of tropes that were really popular at the time that really stand out. First was blunt social criticism. Obviously, the government had failed horribly by allowing the US to go into a financial decline, so there's a lot of criticism towards capitalism and the government in general. You see this criticism reflected a lot in dystopian novels, which are starting to become popular at this time. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley is an example of a dystopian novel from the 1930s. There is also a movement of rejection of progress and hearkening back to better times, which you kind of see a lot nowadays, especially like people saying, oh, let's go back to the 1920 or 1950s when times were better. Times were never really better. There's always problems with times before now, like people now saying like, let's go back to the 1950s because it was better. Didn't think of like women had no rights in the 1950s. People of color had no rights in the 1950s. You couldn't be open about your sexuality. There's obviously a lot of problems, but there was a big literature movement of historical fiction, which you see in things like Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, or in children's historical fiction you see Little House on the Prairie. Another look at the Longing for a Simpler Time is an outbreak in like fantasy novels where you get things like The Hobbit or The Sword in the Stone, where it's just completely made up fictitious fantasy that is loosely based off of English Middle Ages. There is also a movement of authors writing about the poor working class, which wasn't really seen before now. And you see that in like The Grapes of Wrath. there were a group of writers who had become really disillusioned with capitalism, and they created a group called the Popular Front, which supported the leftist forces in the Spanish Civil War. The most well-known piece of work to come out of this was For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. Now, I mentioned a lot of books in there as like examples. Some, but not all of those books I will be reading this month, and I will also cover just completely different books that have nothing to do with the major tropes of the time. The first book for 1941 is one of those books that is not covering one of the major tropes of the time, and that is The Floating Admiral. I actually have a copy of it that I almost forgot about. This is a really interesting, unique novel. It was a group of mystery writers from the 1920s, 1930s, and they have a club called the Detection Club, and a bunch of them got together and they each wrote one chapter of this novel and then passed what was written. So somebody wrote chapter 1, passed it off to somebody who wrote chapter 2, who passed it off to somebody who read chapter 1, chapter 2, and wrote chapter 3, then passed it off again, read chapter 1, 2, 3, and then wrote chapter 4. And they had to kind of create a story where they only got one chapter out of the whole story, and they didn't know what other people were going to write after them, just what they wrote before. So Agatha Christie is one of the most well-known authors on this, and it seemed like just a really interesting concept. The really cool thing about this is they had like rules to this like writing group where you couldn't like purposely try to make it hard for the next writer, things like that. But overall, it sounds like a really interesting concept. And at the end of this novel, in the appendix, all of the authors were supposed to write their chapter, and then they predicted who the killer was, like the who did it and why, who done it and why, at the end of their chapter. So obviously only the person who ended the book really knew who the killer was, but at the end of your chapter you kind of was like, if I were to finish writing this book, this is how it would end, or this is who the killer would have been and why they done it. And then that prediction from each of the authors is in an appendix at the end of this book. So you kind of get to see like the different thought process of different authors. So that's just, it's weird and it's different and it's interesting and I like it, and I'm excited to start the month off with this little murder mystery. Next up is a novel that I did mention earlier, which is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This novel is basically a dystopian novel about the genetic and psychological manipulation of humankind, and there's only one man fighting back against the status quo, and that is the narrator of the story. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I like dystopia, so let's do it. The next one is kind of also a dystopian novel, and it's The Shape of Things to Come by H.G. Wells. It is basically a dream sequence of predictions of what will happen to the world in the next 200 years. And apparently some of the predictions are creepily accurate. So I don't know if that's the best thing to be right. I don't know if that's the best thing to be reading like right now, but I don't know. It sounds fun. Next up for 1934, I've got another Agatha Christie novel, which is Why Didn't They Ask Evans, which is a murder mystery, and apparently as the murder victim dies, the very last thing he says is, "Why didn't they ask Evans?" And so some amateur detectives are trying to figure out who Evans is and why he wasn't asked some question that apparently led to this man's murder. Next for 1935 is Little House on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This is a children's novel, middle grade, I think is what I would put it for modern times. But it's a tale of a family who the Ingalls family, who move from Wisconsin to the prairies of Kansas. I believe it takes place in the 1880s, but I'm not gonna tell you why I put it in that date until the wrap up. So you gotta come back at the end of the month and see what that's all about. This is, obviously it's a children's book, so it should be a quick read. And I know I read this when I was a little kid, but I really don't remember anything at all about it. And we'll see if it continues to lean towards the very problematic children's books that I have been experiencing so far in my my century reading. We'll see. Next for 1936 is a hugely well-known historical fiction, and that is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. I have a first edition copy of Gone with the Wind. The cover has not survived well. My grandmother gave this to me, and I will not actually be reading this copy. It is far too delicate to actually like read it. I'm going to read a ebook copy of it, but I do have a physical copy of Gone with the Wind. First edition, that's cool, right? But this is the story of Scarlett O'Hara, and it takes place like before, during, and after the Civil War. This is also a very, very long book. It's over 1,000 pages. So I'm not being easy on myself with my reads this month. I've got 4 books over 500 pages, and then this one, which is one of those 4, is over 1,000. So I'm rough on myself this month. Fortunately, I'm not allowed to leave my house, so I've got plenty of extra time to read. I did read this in high school, which was 20 years ago. I'm so old. I remember tidbits of it, which with how much I read is actually kind of impressive, and I also have a tattoo of Scarlett O'Hara on my leg. So I remember liking this book, and I'm really happy to be rereading it outside of a forced school setting. So for 1937, any of you who keep up with classic publishing dates probably expect me to read The Hobbit, but honestly, I hate Tolkien's writing so much. I have literally no interest in rereading The Hobbit ever again in my entire life. I don't like his writing style at all. It's too descriptive. He describes everything to such detail that my imagination can't do anything for itself. I'm just told exactly what to think, which is great if you're trying to get a script to make a really good an accurate movie, but not great when you want most of your reading to be left up to your own imagination. And you know what, honestly, not all authors in the 1930s are white people. So let's read something by a Black author. And for 1937, I am going to be reading Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. I almost read this in college for a women's literature class, but for some reason we ended up being behind in the class and had to drop this novel off of the syllabus, and it was the last novel of the year. So let's pick it up now. I don't know a whole lot about this novel. I do know it's a contemporary and it's about a Black woman in the 1930s trying to gain her independence, which is nearly impossible for a woman to do in the 1930s, much less a Black woman to do in the 1930s. So sounds interesting, sounds like a huge change of pace from what I've been reading, and I'm down for it. Next up for 1938 is another fantasy novel. Since I didn't read The Hobbit, I will read a fantasy novel. This is The Sword in the Stone by T.H. White, which is, I guess it's a retelling of the King Arthur story and Camelot, except for it takes place when King Arthur is a child. So before he becomes the legendary king that we know about from medieval writings, he was a young boy, and this is that story of him as a young orphan boy, and he is raised by Merlin in this story, though that's not particularly accurate as far as the medieval tales go. All in all, I like the Disney movie Sword in the Stone, so I'm hoping that I really like this book. Next up for 1939 is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, and this is a tale of poor people in the Great Depression, specifically Oklahoma farmers, as they're just trying to not die. They're so poor. And this story particularly interests me because my grandparents were farmers in Oklahoma, or growing up. They were children in the 1930s, but they were growing up as poor Oklahoma farmers during the Great Depression, and they survived these situations that John Steinbeck is writing about. And I just think that's interesting look on people that I know, even if this tale is fictional and probably far more dramatic than what my grandparents actually experienced. This is still a look at potentially what they could have experienced during this time of their childhood. And the last book for 1940 is For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. This is the story of an American soldier who fights in the Spanish Civil War. And honestly, I read some Hemingway in college and I never cared for his writing particularly. And I think this is one of my books over 500 pages, or it's like 460 pages. But I'm a little skeptical going into this as far as how much I'm going to like it. I was looking through reviews of it, and turns out that most people who love Hemingway's writing hate this story, so that gives me hope as somebody who hates Hemingway's writing that I will actually enjoy this story. But for 1940s, this was like a really, really important book, so I want to give it a shot. And I may end up, if I really, really hate it, I may end up reading something completely else. So we'll see. This is the only one that I'm a little iffy about for this decade, and honestly, that's pretty good. So that's a look at the 1930s. What do you guys think? leave a comment down below with what book you think sounds the coolest that I'm reading this month, and if there was any books from the 1930s that I didn't read and you think I should have, let me know. Don't mention The Hobbit. I'm not gonna read The Hobbit. Also, please take the time to like and subscribe to this video if you enjoyed it and made it this far, and thank you for coming.